I've spent my life as a preacher from pulpits, just like that one. I have had to preach the gospel. And from the pulpit, a person like me, a preacher, arises in the middle of a conversation that a congregation has between God and God's people. And then in the sermon, you make comments in that conversation. And then you listen as that conversation continues after the sermon in the coming weeks. There's something about the Christian faith that is auditory. As Paul says, where does faith come? Well, the Christian faith comes from hearing. It's news that you can't tell yourself. Somebody has got to tell it to you. You've got to hear it. Now, I've written a number of books about preaching, and those preaching books generally look at preaching as a speaking experience, one person speaking to a group of people. But in my new book, Listeners Dare, Listening for God in the Sermon, in that book I try to focus on you listeners, those of you who are out there listening for a word from God, asking yourself that biblical question, any word from the Lord? And I call it Listeners Dare, because to be a listener to Jesus means that you got to risk. You got to risk being addressed by a living, demanding, life-giving God. In Listeners Dare, I give listeners some suggestions for how to get more out of sermons. I speak to preachers about how to listen better to our listeners, because that's required in preaching. And I talk about ways that it's hard to hear a sermon, questions that are appropriate to ask of a sermon, all in service to helping preaching be a more engaging, life-giving experience for you. That's my new book, Listeners Dare.